So we are just about to get started. So please join me from your own living room in welcoming our CEO and Director, Judy Gradwell. Judy, hello.
Hi, and good evening. I usually try to keep my introduction short, but I think we still have a lot more people coming in. So I will talk while everybody is joining us. I'm so glad you're able to join us for tonight's presentation, the Bioluminescent Red Tide of 2020. This is the second in our online Nat Chat series, and it's so heartening for us at the museum to see so many nature lovers joining us online. There's no way we could have fit you all into our theater. I'm Judy Gradwell, President and CEO of the San Diego Natural History Museum, and our building in Balboa Park has been closed for just over 2 months now. But in that time, our work to research, preserve, and share the natural history of our amazing region has not slowed down. Our scientists are still in the field right now coping with desert heat, censusing flat-tailed horn lizards and chasing endangered species all over the county. We have volunteers at home picking and organizing fossils. Our exhibitions team is designing new experiences to spark wonder about the natural world, while our operations team is planning for an eventual safe reopening of the building. Until we can safely reopen the doors, we are thrilled to bring our programming online. Every Friday night at 7, you are welcome to join us on Facebook Live for live virtual trivia with natural history themes. This week is all about plants, but questions span the categories of pop culture, sports, and history. We've also added plenty of digital resources for families to our website. Visit our site's education tab for crafts, games, educational videos, so you can explore natural history from your own home. In order to stay up to date on all this online programming, follow us on Instagram at the handle @SDNHM and on the Facebook page for the San Diego Natural History Museum. Tonight's program is the second in our series of online presentations, and we are hoping that the technology gods are smiling upon us. Please bear with us if we run into any difficulties, and don't hesitate to ask for help in the Q&A box. If you're unfamiliar with the webinar format, your camera and microphone are disabled. You can be as disheveled as you want for this event. The 2019-2020 season of Nat Chats is made possible by presenting sponsor, the Downing Family Foundation, and the media partner, KPBS, the public media station serving San Diego and Imperial counties. We are thrilled to present tonight's talk. I'm sure many of you saw or smelled the red tide as it washed up on Southern California's shores over the past couple of months. The beautiful and stinky phenomenon was one of nature's highlights during our time of confinement. If you happen to go online to look for answers to your red tide questions, you've undoubtedly seen the name of Dr. Michael Latz in just about every news article that popped up. We are fortunate to have one of the world's experts in bioluminescence right here in San Diego, and even more fortunate to host him on Zoom tonight so he can answer your questions directly. Michael Latz is a marine biologist at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at the University of California, San Diego, one of the largest environmental research centers in the world. Over his 40-year career studying bioluminescence, he has investigated the ecological role of bioluminescence, cellular regulation of light emission, the applications of bioluminescence as a tool in oceanography and in engineering, and the use of bioluminescence as an educational tool for outreach. Beyond his voluminous and impressive and creative body of scientific work, he's also provided scientific expertise on bioluminescent bays in the Caribbean and collaborated with artists in developing creative approaches for displaying bioluminescence. He did his undergraduate work at Duke University and has a master's and PhD degrees from University of California, Santa Barbara. Thank you again for joining us, and enjoy Michael's talk, and be sure to answer your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen.
Well, thank you, Judy, for that very nice introduction, and hello to everyone joining in. I'm very excited to talk to you about the Bioluminescent Red Tide of 2020. By the way, I didn't get to participate in the poll, but this is my first online lecture that I'm giving. So I'm interested in bioluminescence, and red tides are just an extraordinary expression of just nature in a most unusual way. It's both beautiful and, as we've smelled, nauseating. So I love the bioluminescence. It's something I've studied my entire career. Usually we study bioluminescence in a laboratory setting. So to see it in nature really is very special. There's a lot more to this red tide than just a pretty light show. So I want to start off by just getting to the basics. And that is plankton. Plankton are the microscopic organisms that are ubiquitous in the ocean, and they're all different types, and they form the base of the food web. So the phytoplankton are photosynthetic, so they use the energy of the sun to grow. They in turn are fed on by other plankton, and those are all fed by larger plankton, and then moving up the food chain to the larger animals. Sometimes the phytoplankton can become very abundant. And if they're so abundant that they discolor the water, then we can call it a red tide. So you may think that at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, we have a sophisticated monitoring room full of banks of computers, staffed 24/7, so we can be on the lookout for red tides. But the reality is that we know about a red tide when somebody sees it. Now, certainly we have instruments taking measurements that we can go back and look at the conditions of the red tide, but pretty much we know about it when we see it. So in the case of this red tide, my story starts with an email that I got from a Scripps colleague, Terry Gasterlin. She says, "We have a red tide in Del Mar. Early morning, pre-dawn surfers report the water glows when they paddle." So this is the beginning of April. And so Terry took a sample of the water, and yes, there were a lot of plankton that were present. So after this, the following week, we had the heavy rains, and I thought, well, that's the end of that red tide. It's never going to develop given those horrible conditions. So I was quite surprised when, in fact, it did develop and grow, and leading to very brown water. The brown water means that there's a tremendous number of plankton in the water. So these are views from La Jolla Shores, right in front of Scripps, where I work. And when Scripps scientists took a sample of water, well, it was very brown. And looking under the microscope, there were many, many of these plankton, extremely abundant. Now there is a plankton camera on the Scripps Pier, and it captures images of these microscopic plankton. And most of the cells shown here are the red tide organism. And so this was middle of April, and we can actually go back to the end of March. This is a different camera on a mooring off of Torrey Pines, and it's showing the dark cells. Those are all the red tide organisms. So it was first observed beginning of April, intensified middle of April, but it was first detected offshore the end of March. So did I mention that the water was brown? The organism responsible for the red tide is called a Dinoflagellate. It has the name Lingulodynium polyedra. And just to keep things a little simple, I'll call it from here on either the red tide dinoflagellate or the red tide organism. But it's a common member of the coastal community. It's been known to form red tides in the past, and it's photosynthetic. So it requires sunlight for growth, and it is a very good swimmer. It'll swim up to the surface of the ocean on bright sunny days and congregate there. It also is colored, as seen here, contributing to the brown color when there are millions of them present. And the brown is due to compounds in the cell that act as a sunscreen to protect it from ultraviolet light damage. So this organism is known to form red tides or blooms, and the word bloom just means when it's in a higher abundance than normal, in Southern California as well as the Mediterranean. But there are several other dinoflagellates that produce beautiful displays of bioluminescence, so I just wanted to mention them here. Pyridinium bahamense is a tropical species, where Knocktoluca scintillans is a species with worldwide distribution. So if you've ever been to the bioluminescent bays of the Caribbean, that's where pyridinium is abundant. Think of it essentially as a red tide that persists throughout the year in just a select few bays in the Caribbean. So these are very unique ecosystems. And Knocktoluca has been producing bright bioluminescence for as long as people have been going out on the ocean. They've observed the bioluminescence of Knocktoluca, here showing a red tide in Hong Kong. So getting back to our local red tide, just wanted to share a couple of images. Certainly there are a lot available online. So this is from the middle of April. And here's a view of the Scripps Pier taken by a Scripps graduate student, showing the bioluminescence with the village of La Jolla in the background. And here we're looking to the north. And this shot by photographer John Moore is exceptional because here's a couple, so it's a romantic setting on the beach with the bioluminescence in the waves, the moon setting, and a meteor streaking through the sky. So John considers this a lucky shot, but given the fact that he was out there for hours and this was taken at 3 a.m., I think it more attests to his ability to just go for that really good shot and his perseverance. So everyone else is taking photos. I had to go out and see it for myself. So I went out the end of April and wow, the bioluminescence is really good. It's as bright as I've ever seen during a red tide, just spectacular. So this is shot from the Scripps Pier, looking at the waves as they break. And just for those of you who haven't seen it in person, it's like this electric blue light shooting through the water as the waves break. So it's the agitation of the water that is stimulating the red tide dinoflagellates. Otherwise, they're not producing bioluminescence. It's only when they receive a mechanical stimulus. So I was really lucky that night because it turns out there were some surfers who went out to surf in the red tide. So for all you surfers out there, if you really want an exceptional experience, maybe think about doing this another time. And certainly in the future, it'll be easier to view these bioluminescent red tides without all the social restrictions that were in place. Certainly the beaches were closed for the beginning of this red tide. So you paddle out through the waves, stimulating your own bioluminescence as you agitate the water, and you catch the wave and ride it in. Now here, you'll notice in the foreground that there are these streaks of bioluminescence before the wave crashes over them. Those were fish that were swimming in the water. The fish were stimulating the organisms to produce light. So let's paddle out for one more wave before we move on. I could watch these videos all day. They're just exceptional. So here we go. Actually, two surfers this time, riding the waves in. So this is just a beautiful expression of nature. I love it. So how is the light produced? Well, bioluminescence in all bioluminescent organisms is the result of a chemical reaction, that there is a molecule that is oxidized. It's called luciferin, and that oxidation reaction is facilitated by a protein that we call luciferase. So the result of the oxidation reaction is the release of energy, and that energy comes out in the visible spectrum. So it's the purpose of the bioluminescence is to be seen by another animal. In case of most marine organisms, the predominant bioluminescence color is blue-green, and that's the color of light that transmits best through ocean water. But there are, in unusual circumstances, animals that produce yellow, green, yellow, and even red light. So I kind of think of it like the light stick, where when you get a light stick, it's not initially glowing. You need to crack it, and that allows chemicals to mix inside, shake it, to mix them, and then you get the light. And the color of the light depends on the chemistry inside. So it's similar with bioluminescence, but in this case, the chemistry is in living organisms. So dinoflagellates produce bioluminescence from multiple sources within the cell. So we're seeing here a high magnification. This is a bioluminescent dinoflagellate, a different species from our red tide dinoflagellate. And there are just many small sources within the cell. And in this exceptional video, which is taken by photographer or artist Yvonne Koo, there are dinoflagellates that experience a mechanical stimulus and they light up. And here we're seeing it in slow motion. So they're encountering a boundary, and that provides the stimulus, and then they almost instantaneously light up from the cell. There's actually a delay of only 15 milliseconds. So it's a very rapid response. And that involves a complex series of biochemical steps within the cell that is something that we've been studying. And you'll see in these close-ups, maybe you detect the dark area of the cell. Well, that's the nucleus. And the bioluminescence then is occurring from all the other areas of the cell. The function of dinoflagellate bioluminescence is to act as a predator deterrent. So imagine this scenario here. Imagine we're off the Scripps Pier, and here are the dinoflagellates floating around in the water. And this animal represents, it's a zooplankton, so it represents a predator of the dinoflagellate. So it's going to swim around hoping to bump into one of the dinoflagellates, grab it to eat it. And then this fish here represents a predator, not of the dinoflagellate, but of the zooplankton. But this is a nighttime scenario. The fish can't see the zooplankton to be able to eat it. So the zooplankton is swimming around, it bumps into a dinoflagellate and grabs it. The dinoflagellate responds with a flash of light that lasts about 1/10 of a second, and that's long enough for a fish, which is nearby, to see that light and to strike. So the result is that that zooplankton becomes more vulnerable to its own predator. So what does the zooplankton do? Well, they have an escape response, that they're not interested in eating the dinoflagellate, but instead they try to swim away. The zooplankton that don't do that are more likely to be eaten by their predator. So you can think of this as a burglar alarm in a way, that the dinoflagellate is producing a flash saying, help. In this case, the burglar, which is the zooplankton, is trying to eat me. And here comes the police, which is the fish predator, trying to, in this case, eat the burglar. But imagine with all these dinoflagellates present, and they are very easily stimulated, the water really is like a minefield. And so in this video, the these are the lobsters flicking their antennae, stimulating bioluminescence. And here's some bioluminescence stimulated by what? Oh, it's a shrimp, but that is going to give away the position of the shrimp. And here comes the squid predator of the shrimp, finding the shrimp based on the bioluminescence that the shrimp was stimulating by the dinoflagellates around it. So there is a concern by animals that they're moving in the red tide in this assemblage of bioluminescent organisms will give away their position. But certainly anything moving like a boat, a large object, is going to stimulate a lot of bioluminescence. This is exceptional video shot by a whale watching group out of Newport Beach. They went out at night in the red tide. You see the bioluminescence in the wake, but even more incredible is this footage of dolphin stimulated bioluminescence. So the dolphins, of course, are not bioluminescent, but they're swimming in the red tide, and the friction from the fluid forces around their bodies is stimulating the bioluminescence. This video, by the way, went viral. Maybe you've seen it. It's just incredible. It's the best video I've ever seen of dolphins swimming through the bioluminescence like this. In fact, the artist M.C. Escher apparently was traveling through Southern California and had an occasion to see the bioluminescence. And as a result, he created this woodcut print entitled Dolphins 1923, showing the boat moving through the water with the dolphins swimming at the bow, lighting up the bioluminescence. So I'm sure you're wondering, well, how common are these red tides? Well, Scripps scientists have been monitoring red tides in La Jolla for more than 100 years. And the first recorded occurrence is 1902, but these are natural events and they've been going on probably for a very long time. Dinoflagellates evolved about 450 million years ago, so these red tides could have been going on for a very, very long time. So just to give a kind of a recent summary, here we are in 2020, where the red tide has lasted already a month and a half. 2019, there was only for 2 weeks, there was a short red tide. 2018 and 2013 only lasted 1 week. 2011 was a pretty good year for red tide. The October of 2011 was very nice, beautiful displays of bioluminescence. And that red tide developed a couple of months earlier than that. But it's really in the mid-1990s that we had some exceptional red tides. So let's put this in perspective. How strong is this red tide compared to these other good red tides? Well, if we look at the maximum abundance of the red tide dinoflagellate, this year, a maximum of 9 million cells per liter. That's a lot. So to come up with these numbers, we don't count a liter. We're not actually counting that a liter of water says, okay, here's 9 million cells. So we take a sample and then we just count a subset, a subsample of it, count the cells in that, and then extrapolate to a volume of a liter. So the next strongest red tide was 1997 with a maximum of 6 million cells per liter. And then the other red tides were about 1 million cells per liter. So we can say that this red tide of 2020 is the strongest red tide in 25 years. And just based on anecdotal reports I've gotten from people who have lived here for a while, it's probably the strongest red tide in this area in at least 50 years. So this is a good one. So 1995, I came to Scripps in the early 1990s. So the 95 red tide was special for me because it was the first one that I experienced. Had really nice bioluminescence in the waves. And in fact, that year was the America's Cup was held in San Diego. And the sailboats were racing both in San Diego Bay and off of Point Loma. And here we're seeing the boats sailing through the red tide. So first of all, you'll notice that the red tide, the discoloration is in patches. It's not evenly distributed. So this patchiness is one characteristic. And the other thing is that there are the boats are making trails through the red tide. That's because the organisms have been swimming up towards the surface, congregating, attracted to the sunlight, and they are congregating at the surface. So as the boats go through, they disrupt the cells that are there. So what about this red tide? Well, it was strong all the way up into the Los Angeles area. Notice the very strong brown, dark brown color from Manhattan Beach and Marina del Rey. And in fact, it extended south to Baja California and possibly even as far as Ensenada. There were reports of a red tide down there. So if it did extend from Ensenada all the way up to Los Angeles, then that's a distance of 1,600 miles of coastline that were affected by this red tide. So that's huge. So this shows a satellite image for just part of this area. This is provided by NOAA, and it's satellite detecting chlorophyll in the water. So the photosynthetic organisms, the phytoplankton, contain chlorophyll that's used for photosynthesis. And essentially the chlorophyll can be detected from space, from satellites. So in this view, the dark red color is the most intense or the highest level of chlorophyll. So it was very strong in the San Diego region, but then it did extend all the way up into Los Angeles area. But then it stopped there. It didn't go any further. So by now you know that the red tide is beautiful. We've seen incredible displays of bioluminescence. Surfers go out and surf in it next time we get one. But alas, all good things must come to an end. And reached a point where the red tide started to break down. So this is a photo I took on May 4th. Noticed foam on the beach. And foam is an indication of breakdown of protein and other organic material, indicating that the red tide organisms were dying. So I came back that night to check it out, even more foam on the beach. So I was very curious to see, well, what was the bioluminescence like? So at the top was the bioluminescence during the peak of the red tide. And the bottom view is from just a little bit more than a week later, the period when we had all the foam. The bioluminescence was less. So the bioluminescence was fading because the organisms were dying. So there were less of them alive to produce the bioluminescence. So with the foam came the stench. Certainly the media had a field day with the stench. Got a lot of press. Red tide causes big stink along local beaches. And thank you, 10 News, for putting a little nicer. Red tide creates strong odor along San Diego's coast. Pretty much everyone living within a few miles of the coast noticed the stench. It was very, very persistent. And it lasted about 2 weeks. The big question then became, when will the stink go away? Well, first of all, the stink or the stench was due to the breakdown of the red tide. the organisms, as they're dying, are releasing their contents into the water. And then that organic material is digested by bacteria. And those bacteria produce their own compounds that have odors. And those compounds are in turn taken up by other, like sulfur bacteria, that can produce other odors, including hydrogen sulfide. So the stink indicated that the red tide was dying. And this had a big effect on water quality. Already we had a problem with the water being discolored and pretty much impossible to filter out all the organisms from the aquarium systems at Scripps, so we had big challenges maintaining water quality in the aquariums. This is showing measurements of dissolved oxygen taken by my Scripps colleagues. This is from the Scripps pier. And what becomes very noticeable, that typically levels of dissolved oxygen are pretty constant or pretty level. So during the day, oxygen is produced by phytoplankton as a result of photosynthesis, and then it's used up at night or taken up at night by organisms as they respire. Well, certainly during the peak of the red tide, you see these big spikes. So during the day, producing a lot of oxygen, and at night, using up a lot of oxygen. But then we reach a point here towards the beginning of May when the red tide is breaking down, that is still producing a lot of oxygen, but there's so much respiration going on at night because now we're taking into account all the bacteria that have been growing up and ingesting the material from the red tide, that the oxygen levels got dangerously low. So this gray area indicates low levels of oxygen that could be harmful to marine life. And so levels of oxygen went down there and persisted in those levels and in some cases, some days, the oxygen levels reached 0. So this is very harmful for animals that are experiencing these conditions. And along with that, there was a big change in ocean pH. So this is another instrument that is measuring pH from the Scripps pier. And this is part of a study or program that's dealing with ocean acidification. So the overall mean is about a pH of 8.1. During the red tide, the pH increased probably as a result of photosynthesis, of increasing the pH of the water. But then when the red tide started to break down, then there was a very sharp drop in pH to extremely low levels. So 8.1 is normal. For here, it dropped down to as low as 7.1. So a 1.0 pH unit change is very, very severe and harmful to marine animals. And we saw the effects of that. So fish kills. Here, sardines that had washed up on the beach, La Jolla shores. Huge problem in the coastal lagoons where the red tide organisms, the red tide water went into the coastal lagoons, and then the organisms died there, bacterial decomposition, and then decreasing the pH and oxygen levels, resulting in fish kills. So this photo is from Agua Hedionda Lagoon in Carlsbad. But this is noticed up and down the coast. So that's sort of a synopsis of what happened during the red tide. So I want to summarize in a way and formalize it, talking about the life cycle of a red tide. So the initiation phase happens offshore. Again, the red tide organisms, the Dinoflagellate Lingulodynium polyhedra, is a common local species. So we're not talking about something that's invasive, but it is local. And what's not known is about the role of cysts. So cyst is a dormant life stage of dinoflagellates, including this species, that are in the sediment, and then they can emerge from sediment to seed a population. So this organism does produce cysts, and it does that under adverse conditions. It can also do that after a certain life stage involving sexual reproduction. Normally, these organisms divide asexually, so one cell divides into two cells, but in some cases, they will have a sexual phase. So in this case, the cell has released the outer membrane layers, and what's left is this smooth-walled cyst. So this is a dormant life stage. It sinks down into the sediment, and then it can persist there for a number of years, even longer. And if there could be an internal timing to determine when these cysts emerge back into the water column to form swimming cells. So the phases of the red tide that we experience are the growth phase and maintenance stage, because those are the parts of the red tide that we get to see and experience. So the question is, what conditions are conducive to the growth and development of the red tide? Well, these organisms are photosynthetic, so they're going to swim towards the surface where the sunlight is the brightest, the strongest, to enhance photosynthesis. But in sunlit waters, the ocean is stratified by depth, by temperature. So here we have the upper layers are warmer than the deeper layers. The upper layers, then the water density is less than the more dense, deeper layers. And in the upper layers, the nutrients are used up by the phytoplankton, whereas the deeper layers have nutrients still available. So one strategy used by this red tide dinoflagellate is that it's a very good swimmer, and it will congregate towards the surface during the day, but then at night they can relax that, and they can swim through this density boundary here, the yellow part, and swim down into these deeper waters to take up nutrients. For non-swimming phytoplankton, they may not be able to swim through this density boundary. And certainly the warmer the water is here, then the stronger that boundary will be. So when the water column is stratified by temperature like this, then it gives an advantage to the red tide dinoflagellates over other non-swimming phytoplankton. And what's interesting is, what was the temperature during the red tide? So this graph shows the temperature series from this, taken at the Scripps Pier over more than 100 years. This is part of the manual shore station program. This means that people have gone out on the pier, taken a bucket sample, and measured the temperature that's been going on for over 100 years. This is a very valuable data set to allow us to look at changes in the temperature of the ocean over long time periods. So the overall average over the course of the year is shown here in the dotted lines, and the gray range shows the overall range over these more than 100 years of measurements. So here we are in blue. Already this year has been warmer than the long-term average, but during the red tide, the temperature increased to levels that is shown with the red dots, levels never measured before at the Scripps Pier. So this is a very warm year. And maybe this is something that could have contributed to the strength of this red tide. The other thing that happened was that we had above average rainfall. So when there's rain, we have runoff from coastal areas, and that can introduce nutrients into coastal regions. So while those nutrients didn't initiate the red tide, because it did form offshore, probably from the cysts, it may have fueled the growth of the red tide and helped in its persistence. So again, we don't know that yet. We'll have to see how, we'll get more information to be able to answer that question better. So eventually, at the end of the red tide organisms run out of nutrients. There are just so many of them. They stop growing, and then they'll start dying. But also because there's just so many potential prey items in the water, then their predators have an opportunity to grow up. And this is what we see. This is a photo of a predator of the red tide dinoflagellate here. This is a different kind of dinoflagellate. It's called Protoperineum. This dinoflagellate is not photosynthetic. It eats, and it snares a potential prey item, envelops it in a membrane, and then essentially sucks the juices out of it and discards it. By the way, this dinoflagellate also is bioluminescent. So it's using its bioluminescence to protect itself from predators. And this year, we've seen an abundance of this organism called Polykrykus. This is a different type of dinoflagellate. Again, it eats, it's heterotrophic, it's eating the red tide organisms, and it is very abundant. I took a sample yesterday, and these dinoflagellates were swimming all over the place. So the predators of the dinoflagellates are growing up in response to a lot of prey items becoming available to them. And a lot of times when we have a local red tide, we'll have this organism, Knocktoluca, growing up. So I mentioned that it has a worldwide distribution, and it itself is normally bioluminescent, although local Knocktoluca are not bioluminescent. In this case, we have not seen it growing up locally, but in Mexico, there's a very strong red tide of Knocktoluca that's been occurring in certain areas. But when we have had it, it's created very striking red tides. So this is Knocktoluca from 1995. So it's been feeding on the red tide dinoflagellates, and then itself, Knocktoluca has become abundant, and then it forms its own red tide. This is a photo taken by my colleague, Peter Franks. Just for reference, this is a 16-foot Boston whaler. And this boundary is not wind-driven, but is actually a frontal feature that is delineating the edge of that red tide. So here we were. I just told you the red tide's breaking down. We've finished the stinky part, and the water is returning to a more natural color. So I was really kind of amazed to see this photo taken by a UC San Diego photographer of bioluminescence from last Saturday night. So here I was thinking that we're just about done with it, but no, it's still going on. So of course I had to go out and see it for myself. So I went out last night, and yeah, there's still some bioluminescence going on. Not nearly as bright as during the peak of the red tide, but there are still red tide organisms present, although not nearly as abundant. It appears there are still some patches offshore that are moving in, and again, there's some of the predators of the red tide dinoflagellates are themselves bioluminescent. So for those of you interested, maybe are thinking, is it too late to go see the bioluminescence? And I say, no, go for it. Find a dark beach and see for yourself. This is from La Jolla Shores. So this is a photo from today. as well as the photo that's behind me in the background, there is foam on the beach. So the red tide still is breaking down. And in terms of how long is this going to persist, we don't know. When is the next red tide going to happen? We don't know. There's a lot we don't know about our local red tides. Certainly this red tide is an opportunity to study it. And from some of the graphs, the data I've shown you, you'll see that there are instruments available to piece together a better story of the dynamics of this red tide. So I just want to end with this shot of Scripps in the Scripps Pier. And you'll see I'm so lucky where I get to work. Scripps is amazing research facility, and I love coming to the beach and seeing the ocean in all its beauty. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael, and I wish we had canned applause. That was excellent.